Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for taking time out of your schedule and joining us. My name is Bethany Servin, and I am the Marketing Director here at UsableNet. Our webinar today is ADA Website Lawsuits in 2020, Insights and Trends, hosted by Jason Taylor, Chief Innovation Strategist here at UsableNet. UsableNet is a technology company with 20 years of experience in digital accessibility. Please note, the information contained in the webinar today is intended to supply general information to the public. It is not intended to constitute legal advice. No specific case law will be covered during this presentation. Our legal partners, respected ADA lawyers, can cover and provide a more detailed presentation on case law. And throughout the year, we have guest presenters who are ADA lawyers to cover these topics during our webinars. So please stay tuned for upcoming webinar announcements when we'll cover this. Today, the information we've compiled and will present is based on public data and is meant to help grow awareness of ADA website lawsuits and of the accessibility challenges that digital assets may present to customers within the disability community. Thank you again, everyone, for joining today. We encourage you to share your learnings and takeaways from this webinar with others, but when sharing UsableNet research findings or insights, especially in articles on the web, we ask that you please reference UsableNet and backlink to our 2019 ADA report. If you haven't taken a look at that report yet, I can send out a link after this webinar via email. Finally, before we begin, all attendees are muted. If you have a question during the presentation, please send them via the chat box. We have reserved 15 minutes at the end for a live Q&A with Jason. And if we don't get to your question or it's too specific to your company and situation, someone will reach out to you. Finally, slides and related resources to download will be sent via email this week. We are also recording today's session. We'll get that video captioned and you will receive an email early next week with a link to that as well. With that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague and our accessibility expert here, Jason Taylor.
Thank you, Bethany. And again, thanks everybody for joining. I first just want to take a quick look at the agenda so you guys understand what we're going to maybe cover and what you're going to get from this. First, I'm going to cover just looking at the trends, but delve down and try to give you some insights around where those trends are going in 2020, but also some detail about what's really behind those trends. We're going to talk a little bit about the domino effect last year and how that might have an effect this year. Something that we've not done before, I wanted to sort of break down a typical week in ADA lawsuits so you get an idea of where these lawsuits come from, what's involved in these lawsuits, what's referenced in these lawsuits. I think it's revealing, especially helps companies think about what they should be doing to mitigate their legal risk if they understand what's actually in lawsuits and how they're structured in a typical week. I've tried to put together some predictions in 2020 around accessibility, which in some way reflects the way lawsuits are going, but also reflects the way the industry is going. And as Bethany said, let's spend some time at the end to make sure I get any specific questions answered and discuss any particular topics people have after this. I wanted to start quickly with a polling question. It's the only polling question I'm going to ask. It gives me an idea of really sort of the types of people that are on this webinar, so I make sure that I tailor the sort of color of the content to that audience. So I just wanted to get a quick understanding of the types of roles that we have. We had over 500 people sign up for this webinar, but I know that there's accessibility really now affects lots of different areas of a company, but also internal and external resources. So I just wanted to get a feel for what that sort of makeup is in terms of the audience. So I make sure that the content I cover today is appropriate. And we're just going to run that for about 45 seconds, and then we'll also share the results so you see the sort of percentages. So you should see that essentially we've got around about half of the people on this webinar are internal resources, which are looking to understand what sort of testing and remediation they should be doing around their digital content. A big section of internal and external legal counsel, because essentially, obviously, the ADA lawsuits are bringing those types of resources in amongst the team that needs to focus on what they're going to do for accessibility. So this is a typical sort of spread that we would expect to see in such a webinar, but it's good for people to see the different types of roles that are being affected in an organization. So let's go through some of the big trends for 2019 in general. So if we start at the trend from the last 4 years, I think this is not new to anybody. Essentially, we've got lots of lawsuits going on. I think it's very important for people to understand that the data that we present, and I'll give you a little bit of quick methodology of where this data comes from. So we track all federally filed ADA lawsuits. That means that we do not count state filed lawsuits around ADA or demand letters. Both of those are on the rise. And the figures that we present around federally filed ADA web and app related is probably half or less than half of the overall legal action that is basically taking place in the market today. The reason we only track federally is because they're reasonably consistent. So when we're comparing from one state to another, it's very consistent in terms of what we do, but also case law at federal level drives a lot of the resulting state and demand letters anyway. So that's one important point. The other part of our methodology is these are not just ADA related cases. We look at every ADA case, meaning there's probably around about 10 to 12,000 ADA cases last year. We look at every single case. We determine whether it's a web and app related case, meaning that the website or the app is the object that is being sued. And we then track those. So the data that we provide to you is very specific to digital lawsuits, so either websites that are being targeted or referenced as the issue, or apps as being issued. We also track some other things, but we don't include them in these trends. So these are big numbers, and they've been growing since 2016. If we move to the next slide, Bethany, I think it's always important for companies to understand why they're big and why they're big now. And I call it the DOJ effect. I think it's important that we don't forget that actually the Department of Justice, way back in the year 2000, started to join private lawsuits, primarily from big advocacy groups, so the Federation for the Blind and other advocacy groups, which were targeting very specific types of living, lifestyle, digital experiences. So, for example, H&R Block, Bank of America, education. And they were targeting specific lawsuits to try to increase the access to digital lifestyle and digital access. Now, the DOJ through that time really built a set of case law where they joined with the plaintiff, and they made sure that the defending company agreed to a settlement. They helped define what those settlements included, what type of remediation was required, what type of yearly sort of testing should be done, what type of user testing with disability should be done. So what we have to remember is that the DOJ has put down over 15, 16 years a very clear case that websites, in their eyes, are subject to the ADA. And in those settlement letters, they essentially created a blueprint for law firms to claim if you weren't doing what the DOJ required of these other firms, you are in violation of the ADA. Because of probably more of a political situation, the Trump administration came out in 2017 with primarily anti-business regulation. The Department of Justice stopped its efforts to stipulate exactly what requirements were needed under the ADA. In the physical space, you get to know exactly how wide a doorway needs to be. You get to know exactly where the light switch needs to be. But those requirements have never been added in the digital space to the ADA. That has left a void of what is required by the ADA. It's left an amount of uncertainty for businesses. So they've probably unprioritized the work because they claim that they don't know exactly what it is. But in generally, what it's opened up is a void for the plaintiff bar to essentially find plaintiffs that are having struggles or difficulties with websites, and back that up with DOJ settlements to show that essentially this sort of blueprint has happened. So just to give you a background, that's why there's so many law cases in play. Because the DOJ established a benchmark over 16 years, and essentially it's very hard to argue away from that early on without spending lots of money. So if we move to a couple of other trends that I'd like to talk about, this is the big one, and I want people to understand why this exists. So retail is over half of the types of companies that get sued. Now, retail is an important economic engine, but it's not, in the eyes of, let's say, someone who's living a life. Retail is not the most important thing in the world. Access to money, access to education, access to healthcare is probably more important. So this reflects the types of law firms and the way that lawsuits are targeted. If I go to why is retail and food industry and others, so Bethany, the next slide. These are the factors, the reason why these are the most targeted. And we're going to get into this when we look at an average week. Lawsuits aren't organic. They're not someone who had a problem with a particular website and then went and find a lawyer and then created a lawsuit on that particular firm. There are some, but they're on the minority, not the majority. The majority of lawsuits in this space are plaintiffs and plaintiffs firms that look to file 10 to 20 a week, which means that in a production environment, they're given a list of sites to go and test. They're given a list of questionnaire of the types of issues that they find on those sites. And then the law firms pick the ones with the most amount of issues and then sue those companies. So retail is easy to visit. It's easy to give a plaintiff, so someone who's disabled that's potentially working in partnership with a plaintiff lawyer, a list of similar sites that they can go visit. It's also easy to do the same action. So when you say to someone, go look at these 20 sites, try these 2 or 3 things, they're the same 2 or 3 things across every retail site. So retailers are very easy to target. They're very easy to what our class is productize around the testing, productize around the documentation of issues. Most issues are very similar. Most sites are very similar. But also the DOJ's done settlement with retailers over the years. So again, there's quote unquote past cases which plaintiffs can point to say the DOJ has established that. Also, retailers, entertainment sites are complex. They're a lot harder to comply directly with the W3C 2.0 or 2.1, and we'll talk about 2.1 and its importance later. It's a lot easier to find issues. It's a lot easier to make mistakes if you've got a complex site. They're also changing all the time. So retailers have a quicker release schedule than, let's say, an educational website. So retailers are, again, potentially probably making more mistakes, easier to find issues, again, better for lawyers. The other thing that we're going to talk about is the fact that companies get sued for multiple times because they have multiple websites and multiple apps. So retailers, obviously, ideal for that sort of target. Lots of them have multiple brands and multiple apps, and we're going to talk about multiple lawsuits and the trend of that. And then, one practical thing that I think will come out over these trends is a lot of the plaintiff law firms have history in this space. They're used to suing retail and suing food establishments, so they know they know that those organizations know that the ADA exists. They have law internal counsel, external counsel that have probably defended ADA physical lawsuits in the past. So there's common ground. They know that they're going to get a reaction, and they know they're going to open up a discussion around what needs to be done around a demand letter or around a lawsuit. And typically retailers and food establishments, you're going to see that, the targeting is not, you do hear of small firms getting targeted, but the vast majority are large companies getting targeted, and they have money. And essentially most of the plaintiff firms in the majority are looking for settlement fees of their fees. So they're obviously looking for someone who actually has budget. So if we look over a couple of the other trends that we saw in 19 develop, this is a really important one, and I think we're going to emphasize it even more when we look at an average week. But of all the lawsuits last year, 21% were actually someone being sued for the second time. Now, why do they get sued for the second time? There's a few reasons. One may be that they haven't completed the work from the first time they got sued. So that's a very important aspect. When someone is sued under the ADA, it's typically one user, one plaintiff, suing a company. Even if they settle, they might get 2 years to remediate, but only 2 years is relevant to that individual user. If another user comes along and they've not remediated, they are able to sue, because the site is still not of quote unquote ADA standards. So just because a company has settled in the past does not mean that they're free of another lawsuit, particularly if they settled individually, which nearly all of them are. So it's an individual lawsuit. Secondly, a lot of these lawsuits are on a second site. So you might find a brand that has 3 or 4 sub-brands, and the lawsuit was on one brand, and then as soon as they settle, they're sued for the second brand. That's deliberate. Plaintiff firms do not allow you to settle across all of your brands and all of your apps. They typically have one lawsuit on one brand, one website, so they open up the opportunity to do multiple lawsuits. You're going to see some figures around, again, a typical week, where you'll see now actually a trend is to go back to all of the sites which got sued for websites last year, and there's one firm in particular and a couple of other firms which are focused on suing apps. So essentially they're just going back to the same list and then creating lawsuits for the native app. Actually, if we move on to the next one, Bethany. Now, the domino effect, I think, is just an effect of business as usual. That's what I would say is the effect of the Domino's case. It was everyone may have heard of it. Essentially, Domino's tried to push back because of, in their eyes, a lack of regulation, a lack of specification, and essentially tried to go to the Supreme Court and get them to hear a case where essentially at the lower court level, or the lower court level, they were losing. Essentially, they were, they wanted not to have to face a lawsuit under ADA. Basically, the Supreme Court didn't hear the case. They rejected the case. Essentially, that just put it back into a place where it was status quo. What we saw over that period, and it sort of reflects the fact that in 2099 there was a slight dip in numbers against 2018. Because a lot of the plaintiff firms over the weeks leading up to it were basically on sort of a go slow. But as soon as the Supreme Court decided not to hear the case, the weekly rate went back up to normal, which is around 60 or 70 cases a week. And that leads me to look at, well, what does a week look like? So if we go and look at a week, typical breakdown, this is actually the first, it's like January 6th to 10th. So the first full week of the year. This is a typical ADA week. in terms of lawsuits. And I just sort of want to pull out some trends so you understand that it's not 70 individuals that had problems with 70 random sites. It's very much a production around finding the sites that are most likely going to be out to be sued for ADA and most likely going to pay and settle quite quickly. So the first thing you'll see is that there's basically 70 lawsuits in that week. So that's a typical rate, about one an hour every working hour is essentially what we see today. We're not seeing a big increase on that because essentially plaintiff firms, there's only a set number of plaintiff firms and some of them are the most active. There's some practicality about how many lawsuits they can handle and make effective. So essentially, I think in 2018, the top 10 plaintiff firms were 80% of the cases. 2019, they're only 65% of the cases, but it's still 65% of the cases. So plaintiff firms only have a certain capacity. So essentially, those firms are really dictating how many lawsuits there are. That's why the weekly number doesn't shoot up or shoot down. Essentially, they've got their sort of weekly capacity that they might work on. And most of them work on a monthly capacity. So one law firm would probably focus on in one particular week, they might submit 15 lawsuits on one day, and that would be all they do that month. And then they're going to work those lawsuits and work settlements. So it's important to sort of see the types of people that are suing. So if we look about some of those trends in the back, right, 50% of the lawsuits are large brands, over $100 million revenue type companies. And again, the second key point is of those, 45% of those cases are multiple lawsuits. So meaning they're not the first time that brand's being sued. So you looked at the 2019 numbers, it was 21%, but actually the bigger the company, the more likely it's going to be a higher number. They're not suing multiple small people for the multiple time. They're suing big companies for multiple times. And then a new thing that we're seeing, particularly this year, because I think we got two very active plaintiff lawyers which are focused on it, is 20% of the big brands lawsuits that week were native app related. And we'll go to like what's being asked, what's being identified in web and native apps in a little bit in terms of what's in those cases. From a state level, I think it's important to address this. The vast majority of those cases in that week is very reflective of is similar. Essentially, you've got over half typically are submitted in New York State. A good portion are submitted in Florida. California seems to be a little bit more popular this year than last year. The reason why California is not as popular at the federal level is because their state legislation is more attractive. So actually most California-based lawsuits are done at the state level. They're not included in this data. But it reflects a couple of things. I think it reflects that these are the regions or the circuits which have the case law which is of quote unquote favorable to plaintiffs, so allowing these suits to be brought. Again, we issued this data in 2018, and this has not changed. 95% of the cases settle, and they settle quickly. Why do they settle quickly? Is because the cost of defending them compared to the cost of settling them is actually more. So we'll get into. I don't want to get into too much detail, but the main difference is ADA is not a lawsuit where you can claim damages. You can really only claim fees. So if a plaintiff firm sues you, the cost will only go up if you defend yourself. If you don't defend yourself, they can only claim the amount of fees that they've spent suing you for the first time, which is why most people settle quickly, because they don't want the clock to start ticking on the plaintiff's fees. And that's why most people will settle and then tell their teams to get this done as quickly as possible, because as you've seen, it's most likely you'll get another one quite quickly if you don't get to a point where you've got the site in a place where they're going to leave you alone, which is fully remediated, good statements up, and we're going to go into that from a practical point of view. Just some sort of like, just to give you an idea, the other reason why they also might be focused, especially in New York, is because a lot of law firms that specialize this are based in New York and in Florida, so that's also home turf. New York might also be a great thing because it's very important to understand it's not New York-based headquarter businesses that are being sued. Anyone who practices in New York City, any website that sells in New York City can be sued. So the types of companies are across America and also internationally. And if you're sued in New York, you've got to defend in New York. So again, you're going to be less likely to want to spend on expensive lawyers to defend yourself in New York. You're most likely going to settle in New York quickly because you don't want to pay the extras to defend yourself in New York. So again, these are all factors that are associated why most suits are done in New York and Florida, but it's not that that's who they're affecting. They're not affecting only New York-based companies. They're affecting every company across America and even international companies that do business in New York State. For example, any retailer that's based in Europe that has a website that sells into New York State, they are subject to being sued in New York. And then just a note on that, sort of again on the app. We talk about 20% of those big firms got a native app lawsuit in that week. Well, it's not 12 different companies, right? It's one plaintiff firm, one plaintiff targeting those particular types of retailers, and they were actually all retailers, and basically, submitting lawsuits one day, 12 lawsuits in one day, one plaintiff firm against 12 companies. And I don't think any of those companies are actually based in Florida. So again, companies all over the country, but that app services people in Florida, so they can sue. So that just gives you a sort of an idea of what a week looks like. And I think the main takeaways is that this is a production in the most part. The vast majority of these lawsuits are plaintiff firms that recognize that they can put together a program that will identify sites which have issues, that are easy to basically templatize, put a template together, very similar issues, similar type of use cases that they can reference in terms of issues, and they do a lot of lawsuits. I would say, again, their opportunity is also based on the fact that most companies have not prioritized accessibility. If a company has prioritized accessibility, has made sure that they're doing a really good job of making sure that most of their top pages, top user flows are fully accessible, don't have issues with regard to working with a screen reader, they have someone testing the screen reader, they aren't being sued. So again, there's a balance between where the responsibility lies. Well, some responsibility needs to lie with the companies which haven't done enough, haven't prioritized. The DOJ have been suing these types of companies for 20 years. It's not a surprise that people who are blind with screen readers want to use a website. And if they can't use a website, they're going to get sued. Now, we can go into the discussion about whether it's an honest suit around someone who really wants to use a website, or if it's more of a outreach of advocacy, to advocate for accessibility. But essentially, websites have left themselves vulnerable. Web apps have left themselves vulnerable because they have not taken accessibility seriously. If they took accessibility seriously, prioritized, did the work, they wouldn't find themselves in this situation. So there's a two-edged sword to why it's possible for all these lawsuits to happen. It's possible because most sites have accessibility issues, which are easy to find, reasonably easy to fix, and companies haven't done it. But also, it's important to understand that there's what our classes are. It's not a natural organic. So the volume is strong because it's a production-like activity around plaintiff lawyers. That's why the numbers are so big. So what else was another thing that came across in 2020? So when we start looking at lawsuits this year, big thing which is very interesting to me, is that they now write in by almost by default WCAG 2.1. Actually, they normally write both 2.0 and 2.1. So what a lawsuit typically does is it identifies a whole bunch of things that their client, the plaintiff, had issues with on the site or the app. And actually, if I show you the most common ones, right? So these are the most common items cited in a case to establish that the website or the app has not provided equal access to their client. Typically uses a screen reader, so you're going to see lots of reference to things like voiceover or screen readers. But you're also going to recognize that these items are probably quite easy to find as problems. So again, going back to how they work, right? They probably give a list of a number of sites to their client. Their client goes through that site. Their client identifies things that they have issues with when they're using voiceover or screen readers. The plaintiff firm may also have an accessibility expert. They're making good money. They can afford an accessibility expert that might also be running a free or a automated testing tool that's also documenting all the issues against WCAG. And they write in a very long list inside of that case. So they're establishing that not only should you make sure that your website works with disabilities, but it also needs to conform with WCAG 2.0. As I just showed you, now they reference 2.1. Now that requires even more work for companies. If you're being told that you need to just settle with me as a plaintiff, you need to go make sure your website's accessible, but also make sure that it conforms with WCAG 2.1. I've just asked you to do a lot more work than when I say 2.0. That's a very important aspect of this. I don't want to get into the lawyer world, but one of the things that lawyers want to avoid is writing too much standards into settlement agreements. The prevailing idea is to make sure that, what you want to do is be a lot more broad in your settlement agreements. Say, we will design to WCAG conforming standards. We will hire and have people from the disability community test on a regular basis. We will document that testing. We'll have an external consultant that confirms that our website is accessible. What you do with that is not make a mistake of saying, and we will be 2.0 AA conforming for the rest of our lives, right? Because it's very hard to get to that standard and be 100%. So it's a note to when lawyers are talking about settlements to try to keep away from version numbers and standard numbers, which aren't written into the ADA. So if they're being sued under the ADA, it's more of a equal access, and you can talk about how you put together a program, your general efforts that you will make sure are in place to make sure the site is accessible, and try to avoid being brought into a tit for tat. Yeah, but you failed these 4 items on WCAG 2.1 AA reference number X. If you get into that mode, you're going to spend lots of time and energy trying to compare lists from one plaintiff firm to your firm. So these are the things which they want to bring you into a discussion around WCAG. What you want to stay around is a discussion of making sure people can use your website if they have a screen reader. They are linked, but they can be completely different conversations and level of effort in terms of complying with those settlement agreements. So this gives you an idea of just the commonality, and to be frank, even when a lawsuit says, and your website doesn't comply with 2.1 standards, they're only referencing 2.2 criteria, 2.0 criteria. They're not getting into doing the testing that they need to do to make sure that your site covers 2.1 in every case, because factors in 2.0 affect 2.2, so they can claim if you fail something in 2.0, you fail it in 2.1, and they throw in 2.1 because it's the prevailing standard out there today. And again, puts you feeling, yeah, they're right. We don't do 2.1. So essentially, they're trying to pile on right now the standards which are changing. Just on that point, it's not gonna help anybody on this call probably, but the WCAG is also going to create a new standard this year, 2.2, and there's also a plan for 3.0 within the next 18 months. So that, again, trying to avoid settlements which reference individual standards, I think is very important because the standards are changing. And if you write in, for example, WCAG with no standard, when it goes to 3.0, someone might come back and say, well, you said that the prevailing standard is 3.0. So trying to avoid those sort of references, I think, are quite useful in settlements. I can move to the next one. So practical next steps. So what do you need to do to try to not be on that weekly list, right? So that's, priority number one. And then what do you need to do to make sure you feel good about not being on a list in the future? So we talk about short, medium, and long term. And we've got lots of practical sort of free resources which can get you, and you can, essentially accessibility is detailed. It takes a certain amount of skill, but it's not impossible for companies to do themselves. We try to come in and make it as painless as possible for companies. That's our goal. Our goal is to make it as quick and easy for your team to do it, or we can do it for you. But everything can be done internally. What we try to do is help companies, not take up their finite resources and do this as quickly as possible, because the quicker you do it, the quicker you're off the list of getting multiple lawsuits. But on a very short-term, practical basis, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to decide what is the standard that we want to put down. What's our goal? What's our standard goal? The reason we still say 2.0 AA is because every law that's ever used a standard, so the federal law, Section 508, the Air Carrier Act, all reference 2.0 AA. Most case law in this space under ADA has said 2.0 AA should be good enough. They don't say that it's exactly the same as ADA. And we would generally recommend that if you're writing a settlement letter and they want a standard, 2.0 AA, you should be able to negotiate. But you've got to think, well, what is digital for us? Like, because we can get sued for anything. And, today it's websites. This year it's probably going to be apps. It's going to be popular, but multimedia videos. There was another lawsuit recently on that. PDFs will probably be next as well. So making sure that you've got an inventory of what you class as digital, right? We would recommend early on creating and publishing an accessibility statement, even if you haven't even started or you're just about to start. Indicate your intentions. Make sure it's easy for people who really have problems to contact you. There is no legal difference between you making a statement in the ADA world to say we're working on it than if you're not working on it. It doesn't protect you 100%, but it's actually one thing that some judges have asked for if a company gets sued is, do you have a statement or a policy? Because that shows that you did actually start the process. You've got buy-in. You're not going to publish a statement unless top people have sort of brought into that. The other thing that a statement does is it gets buy-in. It will get you budget, right? You need budget to address accessibility. You can't be a lone wolf out there trying to make sure your websites and apps are accessible. So creating a company policy, a company statement, you're involving different level people. You're getting buy-in. You can establish, well, look what we're going to say. We're going to take our websites and our apps and our PDFs, and over the next 2 years we're going to do this. Well, we need budget for that, but and then people can start to recognize that actually if you get put on accessibility, there's a company statement, there's a company initiative, there's company budget. People are more likely to take the initiative stronger because of these things. You should quickly test for WCAG. It's what the lawyers do. You should use, and we have a free version of a test, but you can quickly look to see, if someone tested our homepage, if someone tested our top 10 pages, how many issues would they find quickly, right? So that will put you in some place. You should perform user testing with people with disabilities. The whole lawsuit is a blind person with a screen reader can't use your site. Go find blind people with screen readers and test your site. They could be staff. They could be friends of staff. They could be local communities of blind users. They could be organizations like the American Federation of the Blind. They could be companies like us who have resources that can be used for that testing. So if you've gone out and you've started to use people with disabilities and they're okay and they've been able to complete the top 3 or 4 things that your site does, great documentation if you ever get sued. If they can't do it, you know you're in a position where you might well be at legal risk. And we encourage you to hire an accessibility expert, consultant, create a role, hire a company like us. The whole purpose of that is to try to speed it up, to try to make it quicker for your developers to do what they need to do. These are expensive resources. They're finite resources. You don't want them going out and learning about accessibility when they don't need to. It's good to have someone on hand to sort of reduce the amount of time that those people are working. It's obvious once you've got the sort of handle on the early stages, you go over to midterm, you've got to be thinking, what is the real remediation? This is the expensive stuff. The left-hand side is not the expensive stuff. It's important because you need to know what needs to get done. But the medium term is the expensive stuff. It's going to involve your developers. It's going to involve your UX team. It's going to involve your QA team, right? You may have to do a redesign. It really is what costs companies the most to do. So you need to be getting buy-in, you need to be getting budget, you need to be getting time from different groups to do it. There's companies like ourselves who have options where we can do most of the work for you, but someone's going to have to do the work. So you need to start prepping and thinking about what is that timeline, what is that resource structure. And then, unfortunately, accessibility is not a once done and go home. It's something you have to maintain. It's very much like security. You've got to, every time you do a change, you've got to just reconfirm the work you did before is not being changed, but you've kept accessibility if you add new features. And this is where accessibility in the digital space is very different than accessibility in the physical space. In the physical space, a company has to build accessibility into a physical space which will not change for 10, 20 years. A restaurant, once they build their disabled ramp, it is there for the rest of time until probably the restaurant disappears. Accessibility on the digital space is working in an environment that's changing all the time. People running updates, third-party content being used, content being added by marketing, not just development. So you've got to think about the maintenance. You've got to think about the processes in place to maintain accessibility. That's an ongoing life cycle component. So another thing to think about, but also in this legal world, how do you document that? How do you make sure you've got it on record that you do all of this? How can you quickly give that information to your in-house or ex-house counsel to say, yeah, we actually take this seriously. This is our activity. Here's all of our documentation. Go away. We think accessibility is a serious subject and we're doing it. So if you do get lawsuits, you can be strong in your negotiation. So quickly onto what I think is going to happen in 2020, just as a very sort of like broad, hey, what do we think about 2020 coming up? Some of these are legal, but they're all sort of driven by the legal side. Lawsuits are not going away. The rate right now is on par or a little bit higher than 2019. On the federal side, again, state and demand letters are on the rise. I believe less corporations are now understanding that they can't wait and see. They should get to that sort of short-term, minimize legal risk as quickly as possible. You're going to see more lawsuits on native apps. You might start seeing lawsuits on things like PDFs. We're already seeing lawsuits on things like videos which don't have caption. CMS platforms are going to launch accessibility templates. I mean, it's obvious that a lot of these small companies that get sued for $5,000 or $6,000 are not even spending $5,000 or $6,000 on their website. They might even spend $100 on their website. So you're not going to spend $100 on your website unless you think that part of the responsibility for the accessibility is being taken by the CMS. That's the same for retail platforms and for web agencies. When a company gets sued, probably the first thing they do is ring up their agency that built the website and says, why we just got sued? And most of those agencies will say, well, we didn't add it into the contract. It's not in the contract. We're not responsible for it. So I'm assuming the next year when you renew, you're going to want to make sure they're in your contract. We've written about how you add clauses to web agency contracts. I think it's very important to get ahead of, and you want to make sure all the companies that you're paying to do your digital channels should be taking responsibility for accessibility. There's going to be greater awareness in InDesign. In reality, accessibility needs to be built in right at the start to make it affordable. That means the UX guys and the design guys need to understand their decisions affect accessibility. We're already seeing that at the Forrester and Gartner level. They're already talking about, inclusive design. It's a very strong buzzword, and it's very important that those departments feel that they're as important, if not the most important, to the future of accessibility of your digital experiences. We're already seeing major companies hiring a lot of people. If you go on LinkedIn, you'll start seeing the word accessibility and inclusion becoming more and more popular inside of job descriptions. And although this is actually quite painful, these lawsuits are quite painful for certain groups, we believe in the end they are increasing the digital accessibility. So there is an upside. Although a lot of companies are probably feeling under pressure, being pressured beyond where they'd like to be pressured to be accessible. But I think most people, if you sit down with most brands and you said, do you think your website should be used by everybody and be inclusive? They'll say yes. And it's really about how they get there as quickly as possible to reduce, the negative brand experience of getting a lawsuit. So there's my predictions. Hopefully we're sort of close. We've got about 12 minutes of questions. I wanted to pass back to Bethany because she does a great job of sort of filtering those and like pulling out ones which you feel will be like collectively useful. So maybe Bethany, you can give me a couple that you feel like stand out to start with.
Hi, Jason. Yes, thank you again, everyone, for listening to the webinar so far. We did get a question. Can the recording be sent out after? And yes, we are recording the session and we will send out the recording. It will be early next week because we're going to get it captioned, but that will be going out, and we'll also include a link where you can download the slides, which is the next question that just popped up. So to answer both of those, yes and yes, and we are happy to do that. Absolutely. We encourage you to share the resources that we've shared during this presentation. And so there's so many questions coming in all at once. One other note.
So Bethany, sorry, can you just talk about, we're probably going to get to some of these questions, but not all of them. What we do is actually, we actually export them, and then we will individually make sure that everyone gets their answer after the event if we don't cover it in this session. I just want to make sure everyone knows that. So if you've got a question and you think, hey, it's never going to be answered in time, put it in. We'll make sure you get an answer to that question.
If we don't get to your question today, yes, I am able to pull a report of that, and we can reach out to you individually for those. So let's go ahead and just pick out a couple. Jason, would you recommend using a free tool or resource for testing to start?
Yeah, to get an idea, especially to sort of create it, especially if let's say you haven't been sued and you're thinking, hey, we should get ahead of this. How do I get some awareness going, right? There's a number of free tools. We even provide one ourselves. So if you go to our homepage, you'll see Aqua Free Test. That will allow you to test one page at a time. You can test as many pages as you want. So if you want, you can sit there and you can type in 100 over time. But what you'll get from that is hopefully you'll get some really useful information. Firstly, you'll get a summary of sort of against the standard that you pick. You'll get a sort of a general overview and a summary. But you also get tools for you to look at exactly what's wrong, where the problem is on that particular page. And we've also got a range of screen reader tools. So you can actually even listen and experience what that's going to be like on a screen reader. as importantly, it's an online service. So we store that page, and that email that you get to view the report, you can send to anybody. So you could send to any one of your team. They could look at it. It's going to be there for 1 month. So, you can have a discussion about what are the key elements on the key pages that you guys should be addressing, without having to tell a person to run the same report again. So it's there. So that's something to use. And there's other free tools out there. Get an idea, start the awareness internally. I mean, you'll hear this a lot. That's going to test the easy stuff, the sort of like on the surface stuff. It's not going to get deep into, okay, if I used a screen reader and I tried to make a purchase and add a product to cart and then check out, that you need to, a combination. We have a more advanced version, but also, you should be using people who use screen readers to give you that sort of feedback as well. So.
Okay, great. And I will send a link to that resource just to make it easier for everyone to find that on there. Next question. You said that lawsuits often reference both WCAG 2.0 and 2.1. What are some significant differences between 2.0 and 2.1? And we can talk about this at a high level.
Yeah, high level. Basically, it's sort of like a 12 more sort of quote unquote things to check. I actually wrote a blog, so maybe Bethany, we can make a note to send that link out to that blog. Like, what's the difference? There's sort of 3 main areas I talk about in that blog. One of them is a requirement that your site is sort of responsive in terms of it will work in a 400% difference. So there's a number of things in there. Hopefully that blog does a good job of sort of narrowing it down, but just gives you an idea of the extra level of quote unquote checking that you might need to do. But then if you fail a criteria, because basically that's what W3C is made up of, right? So 2.0 AA is 38 criteria you've got to check for and pass. 2.1 AA adds another 12, so you're up around 40 odd, so 50 odd, right? If one of them fails, that's going to mean that you need to go and do something to remediate it. Sometimes it's small, like an alt tag. Sometimes it's big, like responsive. So it depends on which of those criteria you fail, depending on the outcome and the remediation cost.
Okay, great. We are getting some questions about the difference between ADA. Sorry, I'm trying to summarize a couple of questions into one.
Okay.
But about the difference between, we build websites for hotels, so we need to comply with WCAG technical standards, but also ADA content standards of the site. So they're kind of asking about, I think, the difference between someone who is a disabled user trying to book a room that has the features that they need versus making sure that the website is accessible. And I think it might be important, Jason, to talk about the difference, to talk again about our research methodology and what constitutes an ADA website lawsuit for us.
Correct. So it's an interesting one. So actually in Florida, there's actually lots of lawsuits that sue a hotel for having a website that doesn't display information correctly about the rooms that can be used by someone who's disabled. That is quote unquote an ADA lawsuit, but it does not constitute an ADA website app lawsuit for our research, meaning the website itself is not being sued for being inaccessible, or the app is not being sued for being inaccessible. They're being sued for not providing adequate information. So if I want to book a room, I know which room types I can use as someone who, for example, is in a wheelchair. Those are actually quite numerous right now, but for us they're not a suit against the actual website structure and W3C capability of the website. They are a suit against the information provided, and I frankly don't know the details of those cases. We don't track them, so I don't know if there's case law. I don't know if they're actually getting traction. You know, there are actually a couple of good ADA law sites, which actually, again, Bethany, let's give a link to, right? So there's Access Defense, Richard Hunt, who covers these types of lawsuits a lot, broad ADA lawsuits, and we can send that out to give you a little bit more information around, quote unquote, other ADA sort of digital but not digital lawsuits.
Okay, great. Have you seen any lawsuits against the agency that has built the site for a client, or does the liability fall on the client? And I think they're asking about what we see as far as overall trends and insights.
Right. So most of the federal lawsuits, well, all the federal lawsuits are plaintiffs suing a company that has a website or an app. They don't reference anything to do with whether that website was built by somebody. You know, of course, there could be the website owner might have a contract with a company to make sure they did it, and then they might try to pass on that lawsuit, or you know, get the agency to take responsibility or take the case, right? The ones which stand out though are there's actually there's a Californian case right now where an individual Californian has sued the state of California for a website that they paid $65 million for, which is basically a sort of, I think it was a website for one of their nature reserves or national parks. And essentially the individual who is suing the California state for spending $65 million on a website that they can't access. And in that case right now, the original vendor that was paid $65 million is being brought into that case as by the state, because the state had provisions in that contract to say that this website should be accessible to WCAG 2.0, and that web agency basically sort of, quote unquote, just sort of said yes it was and didn't check that it was when they delivered it. So we're already seeing cases, and I just know that there'll be more, but the primary way that most of this will be handled probably is on contract renewal. When you renew a contract with an agency and the agency's been delivering you a website, you're most likely going to want to try to make sure that they take responsibility for making sure that the site stays compliant. Although it's a, you know, and I actually covered this. We can send an email. It's not a black and white decision, because a lot of the times you might have an agency build a website, but then your marketing department is adding content. So your marketing department is going to have to be responsible for the content they generate, and the agency might need to be responsible for the templates and for the structure and for the functionality. So you need to come into an understanding of who's responsible for what part of compliance in that contract.
Okay.
I think we're at our limit for an hour. I just want to be respectful for people's time.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions, and I am able to pull a report. If you have to drop, please, you know, feel free to go ahead and do that. There is a survey that will pop up after the webinar ends. Please take just a couple minutes. It's 4 questions long. Let us know how we did, if we covered the information that you wanted, if you could understand Jason speaking. We take all of that into consideration when we plan future webinars. So thank you everyone for attending today. We appreciate it. I can pull these questions, and Jason, do you have any final thoughts before we conclude?
No, hopefully everyone got something new out of that. And again, to Bethany's point, I really do appreciate you finding some time to share your time with us, and hopefully we'll be able to help everybody on this webinar over time.
Excellent. And I think these questions too will help us generate some future blog posts as well. So if you're not already signed up for the blog, I would encourage you to do that. Thank you everyone for joining today. And with that, the webinar is now ended.